Hello and welcome to Automazing. So far on the channel we have a few main feature videos. The most recent of those was a feature on Rennsport Porsches of the 90s, including a 968 Club Sport courtesy of Porsche Mainline and a 993 RS Tribute courtesy of Porsche Warrington. You can view that video now. I think it's quite good. I hope you will enjoy it. However, in accompaniment to those main feature videos, we'll be continuing our series of Automazing Interviews. For our second episode, we will be welcoming back Rafi Raban of our Racing to the channel. So Rafi, welcome back to Automazing. It's lovely to have you back. I guess more in this current interview, we should focus a little bit more, generally a bit more in depth. So what would you say inspired you to get into this crazy world of cars? Any specific cars that got you into this, that sort of ignited the passion? Why would you say you would still enjoy cars?
Well, I think, growing up as a kid, you have certain influences. So certainly my dad was an influence because he would always tell stories about the cars that he had, and I knew about the cars that he had. And he always, tried to have more of a sporty car, or always drove in a, let's say, sporty manner. So, and still does, by the way. So I think that's what really inspired it. And then, there's a whole world out there that is around motorsports, and obviously it's very enticing as a kid. Mm-hmm. It inspires a lot of imagination, and that's definitely what got me into it.
Mm-hmm. So obviously you were just talking about cars being a major part of your childhood. What was your first car? First series car, that sort of thing?
Well, my first car, and really the car that kind of started the business, was a Ford Probe GT. So this is like the second generation of the Ford Probe, which was really a Mazda, and it had a 2.5 liter 24 valve V6, and it was built alongside the MX-6. So that particular car, actually my dad had one, and he gave it to me when I went to grad school, and that was really my first car. And throughout grad school, when you're in school you don't have money, and I was always thinking what I could do with it. What could I do with it to make it better? Obviously there were many things I liked about it, but it was always about, I'm on a limited budget, and I want to make this car special, and
so the coke started turning. Yeah,
exactly. I had to, at that time, I would say like the real sort of benchmark car, sports car, that to me was completely unaffordable, but it was the E36 M3. And there were many others, of course. There was the Mazda RX-7 and the Toyota Supra. But a lot of people don't remember. Those cars were very expensive, especially for the time. They were all well in the 40s. And we're talking being well in the 40s 25 years ago. So that's equivalent today to be probably a car in the 70s or 80s. So it was completely unaffordable. Also, insurance rates were very high at the time. Yes. So the question was, okay, I got this Ford Probe GT. It was a good, solid base, and it's like, what can we do with it? What can we do with it to make it, to bring it up several levels and really make it special? And now in grad school, you're just thinking about those things. You don't have the money to do it. And once I started working, that's what I started doing. As I had the funds, I would do a project here and there. And that's really what got me started in this industry.
So I'm just sort of thinking, as you started on racing back in 2001, what would you say were the main areas that you focused on fine-tuning the Probe and of course the MX-6 of the time? Were there any specific areas or flawed parts of the car that you wanted to focus on?
I got started initially just like really basic stuff. We started with clutches and flywheels. Most of those cars were manual transmissions. That's what made them, actually that was one of the best things about them. So most of the customers out there had manual trannies. So we went for reducing rotating weight. So the flywheels on those cars were a really big improvement. You would go from like 35, 40-pound flywheel to like a 15-pound flywheel. And it just made the car so rev happy, especially with the manual transmission. It was so easy to rev match, and it was just more fun to drive. And then I would do suspension mods. But, you know, the reality is exhaust, of course. But the reality is it just left a lot to be desired from a point of view of power. Although it was basically powerful enough for street driving, you know, the next step was power.
I guess also another car of the time, in addition to the MX-6 and the Probe, of course, rival sort of that technically Japanese sport compact car era, was the Honda Acura Integra.
Yeah.
Have you ever driven one? How would you compare those two cars? They were so heavily compared.
I did. At the time, I was always a big MX-6 Ford Probe fan, and I would actually go and drive those cars. I'd go to the dealership, and I felt bad. I would pretend like I was really going to buy one, and I would go test drive them every time the new model came out. So I drove, of that era, of those front-wheel drive kind of hot coupes. They're not all hatches, but I drove, in addition to the Probe and the MX-6, there was the Honda Prelude, and then the Prelude SH, they called Super Handling, the Acura Integra. I've never driven an Integra Type R. That was kind of more the track version of that, but they were very rare in any case.
Of course.
And then there was the Eagle Talon, Mitsubishi Eclipses of the time, and those were kind of like the hot cars. In addition to a lesser extent, the GTI at that point went to a VR6.
Yeah,
So, so those were the cars. I would constantly go out there and test drive them and just see like what was better about them and what was not as good about them. But honestly, and even to this day, I was just impressed by the Probe, the capability of it. It was a very estimated car. And it's kind of funny because it seems like I've always gone after these cars that are kind of very appreciated, let's say. Like, to me, it doesn't, like, there's a lot of cars out there that everybody just jumps on. Oh, this is the best, this is this is that.
The more obvious choices.
Yeah, the obvious choices. I don't like the obvious choices because, you know, when you just go and follow people and do the same thing other people are doing, that's not interesting either. And so it's really nice to do unique things. But the basis, the car was a really, really decent car, and I would track it as well. And there was no aftermarket for it, but that was an opening for me to do my own thing.
So I guess you had the Probe for a few years already. How did you progress from that in terms of your cars?
I had the Probe for a number of years, and I held on to it for a long, long time. But at that time, I was not doing RR racing full time. I changed jobs, and I really decided to get into Subaru WRX and STI tuning. And that was really the hot car at the time. If you recall, you know, in the early 2000s, when those cars came to the States and started coming to the States and elsewhere, you know, they were really hot cars. So at that time, I actually became an Ecutech dealer. Ecutech, if you don't know, is a company that specializes in Subaru ECU tuning. So this is already 20 years ago. And I would just tune a lot of these cars. And at the time, you know, bang for the buck. And that the WRX and STI, again, were one of these cars that at the time, you could do stuff to them and really bring them up to the level of some serious, you know, more of an exotic cars. So it was no problem to take an STI and bring it to the level and beyond the level of the contemporary Porsches at the time. And that was one of the unique things about it. Over the years, that's actually changed a little bit.
Of course.
Because the top-end cars, like the Porsches, like the Ferraris, they have just accelerated so far away from the more pedestrian cars that you can buy, like a Subaru WRX or STI. And of course, you can do crazy things with them, but
they've kind of stagnated a bit.
They've stagnated.
Yeah.
They've absolutely stagnated. Because if you remember, like my first Subaru was the 2004 STI. It was actually a 2-liter STI. And that was essentially a better engine. The EJ20 STI engine was a better engine than the latest turbo 2.5 they put in, the latest 20 whatever. It's just better. So they've stagnated, and that's kind of an interesting story.
It's interesting actually with the Subarus, how they've really stagnated. You know, at the time, a Golf GTI had, what, 160 horsepower thereabouts?
Correct. Yeah.
Nowadays they have 260, whereas a WRX has 270.
They have gone absolutely nowhere, and it's interesting how, to what extent they've gone nowhere, and to what extent they've actually perhaps even gone backwards, because
Power to weight ratios must have gone
the
way
power to weight
lower
ratio,
because of all the modern tech they've had to put in.
power to weight ratio has gone down, and like I said, the EJ20 semi-closed deck STI was their best engine ever, and then they just went backwards.
Of course.
And quality problems, you know, stupid little things like that. And that's one of the reasons why when I revamped our racing, I didn't really have an interest in doing Subarus.
Yeah.
In addition to the fact that by that time, everybody was just
It was
doing
way
it.
overdone by that point.
Yeah, and it was just, it wasn't,
heavily
it wasn't
saturated.
interesting anymore. No, so.
But between that time you started our racing and, of course, your earlier Subaru days, you also had, I believe, a Honda S2000 between them.
Yeah, that was one of the reasons I ditched the Subaru was, it's not that I didn't like it, it just got to a point where I don't want to sound like stuck up or anything, but there's a stigma in driving some of these cars. And, you know, once you got into 2011, 12, you know, you'd be pulled over sometimes by police for no reason because you're driving around in a blue STI, and it's the thing is just such a, there's such a stigma around it in a sense, because there are some irresponsible owners, or they tend to be younger guys. So I was kind of looking for something more sophisticated, rare, and where I lived at the time, that was actually quite rare. So I did, in 2011-ish, I bought a 2010 2-liter Honda S2000. And that was a car where I was very, I was happy with the feel of the car. And my personal feeling about that car is ergonomically, the dashboard, how close everything is to you, how everything makes you feel is very, very good, except for the seats. But
Yeah,
everything else is like so good. And now perhaps you need to be a smaller guy like me, but just the ergonomics of it, the feel of it, it was very, very good. The frustrating part about that S2000 was the lack of power.
Yeah.
Now some people will say, no, you don't need power. The reality is,
I think especially going from, you know, a heavily torque-heavy Impreza,
that's right,
all the way to, you know, the very peaky VTEC.
That's right, because
engines.
that Impreza, it was like, I was making around 420 to the wheels, but on a very responsive twin-scroll turbo, and yeah, it was actually very responsive and powerful. It was quick. It was very responsive and quick. But the S2000, I found like I just had to drive the wheels off it in order to get it to do anything. And it was frustrating a little bit. And at first I actually didn't have an intention to do much to it, other than maybe suspension brakes. But it became clear that that car needed power, but it could easily handle the power. And I went on to discover that that 4-cylinder engine, I honestly feel, is probably the best 4-cylinder engine ever made. The fact that an 11-something compression engine, ratio engine can take 16 pounds of boost, totally stock, and just take a beating for so long and take that is just amazing. So that car left me very impressed. I really liked the fact that every time I would get into it, it would feel like a special event kind of a car. And that's one of the unique things about it. And yet, it wasn't quite as minimalistic as some of the other cars, which are also lighter, perhaps like a Lotus Elise, which those are more extreme cars. But S2000 kind of had an element of both.
Yeah.
It was refined enough where it was a pleasure to drive and very responsive, but it didn't feel like a go-kart, like a Lotus Elise feels, quite frankly, like a go-kart that somebody could have built themselves.
Yeah.
So S2000 left me very happy the years that I owned it.
Then, of course, you restarted auto racing back in 2014, 2015. You didn't go the S2000 route. You went for another more Japanese rarity. Maybe we should discuss that.
Well, I guess that's just like how I guess that's my calling, is to pick sort of unique things and maybe underappreciated cars. So in 2014, I knew about the ISF and I hadn't bought one yet, and I thought, well, what could I do that again is unique, that there's just nothing out there for it, and what could I do? And the ISF really, really jumped out because, of course, it has that combination of, Lexus reliability, V8, naturally aspirated. It's rare, it's underappreciated, and a lot can be done if somebody just decides to do it. I also happened to, at that time, I was talking to a friend of mine who had just driven one. He was visiting, I think he said he was visiting family in California, and he drove one. He said, and this is coming from a BMW guy, he's like, I drove an ISF. That is the most underappreciated car I have ever driven. It's just shocking, and I can only imagine what you could do with it.
Oh,
so that's what we decided to do, and that was a really good starting car, which of course we still have, and we've taken it quite far. But definitely a car that holds a special place in my heart.
It really shocks me, the ISF, how underappreciated it has been over the past 15 years it has been in existence. The media, when they first tested it, originally, of course, open diff, all that.
Yeah.
It was a group test loser.
Yeah.
When compared to an M3 or a C63 or RS4, they always seem to lag behind.
That's right.
Which amazes me because the car's creator, Yukihiko Yaguchi, he focused on making the car as responsive and as pleasurable to drive as possible. And when you consider the fact it's a Lexus, how this whole project of F jumped out of nowhere, it's quite impressive, actually.
It is an impressive project, but if you recall, and you've interviewed Yaguchi-san, I've always sensed the sense of frustration in him because I sensed like he wanted to do the special models. Like in one of your interviews, he said he wanted to do the lightweight concept. He wanted to do, they did do a CCSR version of the ISF, for example, but it was never really a production model. And that's the difference between Lexus F and BMW M. Because the BMW M, they're more likely to make those special models. They'll call it the M or the M competition. They'll make it stiff. They'll make it responsive. And Lexus has always been afraid of taking it that far. It's almost as if they don't have enough confidence in their customer base that they will accept it. And to tell you the truth, there's probably some truth in that. But
considering how few of these cars have been sold over the years, over 3 F models.
That's right. And there's some truth to that because Lexus customers are fundamentally different than BMW customers. The Lexus customer, if their brakes squeak, they're much more likely to come to the dealer and drill a hole in their head about it. Or if they hear the slightest,
NVH.
Noise, vibration, hardness, the dealer's going to hear about it. And that's just the type of OCD kind of customers that Lexus attracts. So perhaps, that may very well be the case, that they can't build those extreme models because they kind of anticipate more of those issues. I always say, I remember when we first bought this 911, it was totally stock, and I'm driving this car in the back roads, and I hear every little squeak and rattle, and it definitely does those things. And I am thinking, the Lexus customer would come back and just say, I want to return this. Like, I want to have nothing to do with this. Like, just take it. This is unacceptable. So, but that's where we come in. And we're not really, obviously, we're not catering to the typical Lexus customer when we do the ISFs or when we do, our RCF stuff. We're catering to the guys who appreciate the...
It's a more specialized customer.
The basis of, and then they want to do something special with it. They're willing to make compromises. So.
Yes. I guess also, again, with that case of Lexus F, I feel like Toyota kind of got a little bit confused. Because on one hand, they were kind of going, Lexus F, okay, we're going to make the ISF and then RCF, GSF. We're going to put some little investment into an F. Yet simultaneously, they've kind of gone down the route of Gazoo racing. Mm-hmm. So I think they kind of needed to tread that line a little bit better, just between F and Gazoo.
I think the certain elements of the Gazoo racing are welcome. Certainly the GR Yaris got a lot of acclaim and rightly so.
Very much.
I think the Corolla, visually, I think it's a big disappointment. I mean, the car looks like a cheap econo box. I don't know how you could look at the car and be impressed by it. It just looks cheap. Of course, it's not cheap, but it is, and it weighs more than the Yaris, and the Yaris really got the acclaim because it was the weight. The weight makes the difference. Yeah. And so it kind of lost some of that. Yeah. So on the one hand, the GR did some things right. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, which is the big fail, is the Supra. Not that it's a bad car.
Extremely popular now, especially
it
with
is very popular, and the tuner crowd likes it because it's a turbo, and you could pump up the boost, and you can make like 150 horsepower, and it just it's relatively easy. And if you're on a budget, but it was such a mistake from a marketing point of view, from a brand point of view.
Toyota.
To not make it a full Toyota, because all they did was they told Toyota customers, hey guys, it's okay now to buy a BMW.
True.
Maybe I should just go buy an M2. It looks better anyway. So,
I'm not sure the new one looks better.
Not the new one, we could argue about that one. But yeah, I mean, big mistake. So that is frustrating, being a Toyota guy and a Lexus guy. Mm-hmm. It was frustrating to see that.
But I guess with this case of the Supra, of course now people I think are now more accepting of the Mark V, the A90, that it is a proper Supra successor because it's a straight six turbo, coupe, etc. But I really would argue in fact that the RCF is much more of a Mark IV A80 Supra successor.
Yeah.
Of course, Yaguchi-san was involved in both of those cars. Yeah. He was involved in the first four Toyota Supra. Mm-hmm. It's, of course, has the bulletproof Toyota reliability. The more, I guess, GT slightly more focused cars as well. And more understated, less obvious choices to the likes of a BMW, I guess in period would be like an 850 in the 90s, or nowadays M4 or something like that. Yeah. I guess that would be a much more worthy successor to the Supra name.
It definitely is a worthy successor to the Supra name. The main difference is the lack of turbo, which complicates the big power tunability of the car. But again, another area where they're very similar is, people look back at Supra, MK4 Supra, wow, these are amazing cars. Well, nobody wanted one when they made them.
Exactly. Yeah.
Nobody bought them when they made them. Like literally, very few people bought them. That's why they cost what they cost today, because they're rare.
And I think they were cut off after only like 3 or 4 years.
Yeah. So, especially later years, very few were sold. And they were totally underappreciated. They were extremely expensive.
Yes.
So obviously the move, Fast and the Furious, that really brought them back. But they were definitely underappreciated back when they were actually in production.
Mm-hmm. So nowadays, of course, RCF is kind of going to the end of its lifespan. GSF is gone. There's no new ISF, but there's, of course, the IS 500. What are your thoughts on the future of Lexus performance cars, especially since for the past few years, they've been rumoring always, all these rumors out of Japan that there's going to be this new turbo V8. What are your thoughts on Lexus?
Well, I don't have any inside track about turbo V8s or anything like that. So we're pretty much at the end of the line. If they're not going to do it in the next couple of years, they're probably not going to do it, right? I think the IS 500 is a nice car, but it is, I mean, in terms of having driven it, in terms of dynamics, the engine's great. In terms of dynamics, the chassis is so lacking. The suspension is so lacking. I mean,
I guess that's why they kind of had to do the whole F Sport performance thing.
F Sport performance. Listen, this is, I mean, it's like a little step above your IS 350 F Sport. So on the other hand, it's got a lot of potential because if you fix all those things, then yeah, you can.
It's a perfect tuning base.
It's a beautiful car. I mean, the new design of the IS platform.
That's why I don't get why people don't get an IS over or a Giulia over 3 Series, especially in all the modern BMW designs.
Yeah, the modern BMW design really dropped the ball. I mean, those front grills are horrendous. The sides of the car, it's almost as if they exchanged designers with Hyundai. Because like Hyundai is making nicer cars and BMW is making cars that look like Hyundais. And it's obvious. And like it's funny, like the BMW fanboys, you know, they see this car, which is just horrendous, and then you know, like 3 months later, well, it's growing on me. Like, you know,
that's what's happening. With
basically,
BMW,
BMW can put out anything and they like it.
Yeah.
But it's just horrendous. Like the designs are horrible. They're big. They're ginormous. They make a lot of power.
Oh yeah,
they're
extremely
fast
underrated as well. Yeah.
but they're horrendous. I mean, these are not elegant. They're not beautiful cars by any means. They're just
So I guess really sort of
horrendous.
Lexus is kind of, to an extent, I guess, with the RCF is of course still in production. The IS 500, the IS 350, which is still a nice car but not quite performed. They've really more replaced, I guess, BMW.
Yeah, in some respects, yeah.
Sort of, I guess, so-called the ultimate driving machine. You know, a sports sedan that you can use on a daily basis. They're still responsive and neutral handling and enjoyable to drive.
Yeah, in some ways. And then the new IS sedan, the styling is just really improved. And if you compare really IS 350 or IS 500 just to the equivalent BMW, I think this, from a styling point of view, they really blew it out of the ballpark. And it's just the question of the dynamics of it. So, you know, at that point, if you want to customize that, I think there's definitely a lot you can do.
Yeah.
I think it's silly, you know, people looking at the specs and acceleration numbers and sort of dissecting that.
Yeah.
It's just silly because these cars are plenty fast for the street.
Of course.
And to go and analyze by how much the M4 is faster, it's dumb. It's dumb. But you can gain a lot more with those cars just by fixing the suspension, getting the car very responsive. It's like a whole other world of driving enjoyment in that case.
It's just more fulfilling, sort of, really the, how do I say this? More working with what Lexus already had, because it's a fantastic base.
Yeah.
And then just really kind of bringing the car fully to its full potential. Really.
Yeah, that's right. And then it can do everything you need it to do, you know, unless you're a street racer. And
in which case, you know, JDM, you can just bag it and
suspension. So the bottom line is, the new cars are great. They just need you know, that if the customer is willing, if it's the type of customer who's going to say, yeah, you know, I don't mind a little bit of harshness. I don't mind a little bit of bumpiness for the sake of this car really responding to what I'm doing. And I think we're going to see a lot more of that as a car like the IS 500 goes into the second-hand market.
Yes.
That's typically when people are more of the purists, more likely to track them, more likely to do things to them to make them more, you know, real enthusiast cars.
I really do see them becoming more appreciated, especially as many manufacturers, again, we're not quite sure whether the whole industry is going to go full EV, but as more manufacturers start to go full EV, suddenly, you know, these two GSE 5-liter V8 powered cars,
that's
a lot more appreciated.
Yeah, it's the end of the line.
Not only because the engine's just a bit more analog, in terms of the interior is a bit more basic, chassis of course as well.
Yeah.
They're really going to become a lot more appreciated.
Yeah.
Well, I guess now, so we've covered the whole Lexus bit. I guess also now it'd be worth discussing this grey car behind us, over the past few years, have also entered the Porsche market. What was really the decision, so the thought behind that process, going into Porsche from Lexus?
Well, again, you know, we wanted to do something more, a little bit more exotic of a car, and it's same exact theme. Basically, do something that other people aren't doing. Now, the 991 generation Porsche, and to a lesser extent the 997.2s, they came out with a totally new engine, a new flat six in these. And one of the reasons we picked that is that engine is like a really stout, sort of problem-free engine. Earlier water-cooled Porsches, you know, they had those IMS bearing issues, they had cylinder bore scoring issues. They really went through that engine and they really fixed a lot of things. So whenever you're going to go modify something, you really want to start with like a sound base, a good foundation. And that engine seemed to be a good foundation. Of course, we didn't know at the time to what extent it was a sound foundation, but it seemed to be a good foundation. And the normally aspirated Porsches, they will always have a special place in, you know, the Porsche owner's enthusiast's heart, because of, one of the reasons is the sound, and the other reason is the way they deliver the power.
Yes, they're very linear. Yeah.
They're very linear, and they're normally aspirated, so they're linear. They don't make a lot of torque.
It's not like with the M is like, you know, this whole torque wallway, something, you know, you find yourself
Exactly, and you can see that. All you need to do is look at a video where they're testing a car like an M4 and pay close attention to the driver's hands, whether it's an M4 versus, say, even an RCF or a Porsche GT3. And you can see how much smoother the drivers are when they don't have that wall of torque hitting them when they're going corner exit and they mash down that throttle, when they don't have to fight the steering wheel. The whole steering wheel shuffle thing is not a good sign. It's not a sign of a balanced car. It's not a sign of a car that is joyful to drive on the track situation at the limit. Once you start shuffling the steering wheel. And so that was the beauty of the NA Porsches. The only downside of them was, the Carreras, for example, the Carrera S is limited to about 400 horsepower. And, you know, by today's standards, 400 horsepower, you're at the track, you're going to get past a lot. It's just the way it is. Cars have become very powerful out there. And GT3s, too, for all of their aero and their ability to corner at very high speeds, they do need more power for straightaways. And that's why we decided to go the centrifugal supercharging route. A couple reasons. One is that when you're supercharging an NA engine, you don't want that wall of torque. So like an engine that is built for supercharging, you could put like a Roots blower, and fine, if you want that torque, that will work. You're going to design and choose connecting rods and pistons designed for that torque. For an NA motor, a motor that's designed to be normally aspirated, you don't want that wall of torque. It's not built for it.
It's about keeping the NA character.
Yeah, and you want to keep the NA character because you don't want to change. You got a 991.1 Carrera, and you could just go out and buy a turbo 991.2. It looks the same. It has a completely different character. Some people may like that character. Some people may like the fact that you could just drive it fast and never go over 5,000 RPM because it has all that torque, and it immediately it makes the torque. Some people don't like that, especially to a certain extent if you're tracking it, because you don't want that torque to hit. You want it to be smooth. You want the car to feel smooth, and at the same time, you also want the sound of the NA car. And you want the responsiveness of whenever you hit the throttle, that at least it's there. It may not make a lot of torque at lower RPMs, but the engine immediately reacts. And even in the best turbo cars, there is some lag. There is some lag in response while the turbo spins up, especially at lower RPMs. Of course, when they do spin up, they come on hard.
Yes.
But so the character, so basically what we've done here is we haven't ruined anything about what makes it good. So we haven't ruined any of the innate characteristics, but we've kind of enhanced the top end power, which is what the car needs, just to be more relevant today.
Yes. So I guess also, since of course you have supercharged the 991.1, of course GT3s and RSs, but I'm curious to hear what was your initial impression of how the 991.1 drove?
Actually, I wasn't really happy with it at all. And the car was totally stock, and we were waiting. We didn't have the time to start working on it, so it was probably a good 3-4 months before I really started working on it. And I'll honestly tell you, I hardly drove the car. Because every time I got into the car, I just felt like everything that I touched, I didn't like. This particular car had the multifunction steering wheel.
Yes.
Of course, what's the first thing you touch when you get in a car? The steering wheel. It has these stupid shifters on the steering wheel,
Yes.
where it completely counterintuitive. It doesn't have paddles. You have to push the button in, I think, for an upshift. I don't even remember anymore. Back, both buttons back. It was
It's way
just
too
dumb.
complex, yeah.
It was just dumb. If you drive any other car with paddles, whether it's a PDK or automatic, it made no sense. The seats were horrible. They're sport seats, so this didn't have some race buckets that you get in a GT3 and pay $7,000 for as an option. It had the standard seats, which were just, not that supportive. And the whole time I was thinking, like, what are all these reviews? I'd even go back sometimes and read the review of a 2012 911 and be like, see these glowing reviews. This is amazing. This is the best thing ever. And I'm thinking, like, are they driving the same car? Like, it just didn't make sense. And then I actually decided to track the car with it being totally stock. And I had part of it was my non-familiarity with driving a rear-engine car, which is definitely different.
Yes.
But I just found the thing to be all over the place. It was either understeering or it was oversteering. It was not balanced. It was, mind you, again, I was unfamiliar with the rear engine to a certain extent. Maybe the tires could have been better, but it wasn't a GT3, let's put it that way. GT3s, from the box are made for that. But the Carreras, I just felt like they really needed a lot of improvement in terms of suspension and,
I guess that is sort of a thing with modern Porsches nowadays. The GT3s really define the 911 a lot more, that whole 911 driving experience. The Carreras, I think they really try to tune them much more conservatively, to be more comfortable and approachable for, say, a Cayenne driver, rather than a traditional Porsche sports car person.
Yeah, they're aiming it for it to be more of a GT car.
Yeah.
Rather
than a GT car.
And they're definitely, I'm sure they're very, very capable in the hands of a great driver, and the fundamentals are there. But it wasn't in the budget for us to do a project GT3, although we do supercharge them, and we did end up supercharging the GT3s as well. But the question was, again, like, why? Maybe we could just go the affordable route here. I mean, fundamentally, these cars are very similar. This is just a lowly 3.8 Carrera. Well, how can we make that into a really special car without going out and buying $150,000 used GT3? At the time, we bought this, the price difference between this and the GT3 is probably $70,000. So,
and since they have risen a bit as well.
but everything has risen. But yeah. So again, it made sense. And whenever you do a project, you have to think about it. Does it make sense? Can you? So yeah, it definitely made sense because a lot of people own these. There's a lot more of these out there, and you don't have to go crazy with a suspension aero. Maybe you just want to use it as a street car and you just want more power. In that case, you probably don't even want a GT3 because they're not particularly comfortable. So it definitely makes sense to do especially a base Carrera. A because the base Carreras really don't get respect. I mean, they're like 20 grand under an S, and they're great cars, essentially the same engine.
But they're arguably better because there's 3.4 instead of 3.8, but they have the hot cams. So
Well,
it's
it's
a slightly sweeter engine, I guess.
I think most people will tell you, people who've driven a 3.8 versus 3.4 will tell you that it feels like a lighter, revier engine. Definitely makes less power, but it feels like a lighter, smoother, more rev-happy engine, and they look the same. So it's a great starting point if you're looking to save 20 grand versus an S. It's a great starting point.
Agreed. So of course, over your time with the 911, you have done a lot of things with it. Obviously, the supercharger, a number of suspension mods as well. I see you have a bit of aero going on as well. Brakes, of course. I do see right here in the middle between us a new product that you and R Racing are going to have. These new RSR style mirrors.
We're going to put this out next week, and this is our new full carbon mirror. The inspiration for this was, of course, the 911 RSR race car, and we kind of saw some guys spending like $7 grand and like buying the actual motorsport mirrors and putting them on some GT3s and stuff. And I was like, that's crazy, first of all. And secondly, the mirrors are so big, they're out of place on some of the narrower cars. And we wanted to make something more proportional and aesthetically pleasing, all carbon. And so this is actually our first aesthetic product for the Porsche, is the mirrors. We'll come out with this actually next week.
Sounds great.
Yeah.
So Rafi, thank you for your time, for all the lovely information on all these Lexus and Porsches and everything. We look forward to having you on the channel in the future. To everyone else, this has been the first episode of our Automazing Interviews. Well, second, really. We look forward to having more of them out in the future. Thank you all for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe.